Welcome back to Sip and Talk. We're jumping back in.
Yep, ready to dive deep.
The live streams of a Taiwanese influencer in China have sparked significant reactions. Today, we continue our discussion in the third episode for our eager listeners, as his live streams are still ongoing. So,
you handed us a whole stack of info articles, posts, reports.
All centered around this really controversial visit to China back in June 2025 by a pretty well-known figure from Taiwan.
Right. And the reactions it kicked off were, well, pretty intense. So our mission today, as always, is to unpack all that for you.
We're going to sift through what this information highlights, what he actually did, how people reacted, and what the bigger picture might be, especially around, cross-strait stuff and information campaigns.
It's a fascinating look at how actions get perceived, especially online when politics are involved. Things can blow up fast.
Okay, let's get into it. The background here is this figure, known in Taiwan for being, let's say, pretty outspoken, straightforward, tough image.
Yeah, that's the persona. And then he goes on this trip, Shanghai, Hangzhou, June 2025. And it's framed apparently as a peace ambassador kind of thing.
Aiming for peace, okay. But here's where it gets messy, according to the stuff we read. He live-streamed parts of the visit.
And it was his behavior on these streams that just lit a fire under people.
Yeah.
Widespread criticism.
So what was he doing? One major theme that comes up again and again in the critiques is this feeling that he was, putting Taiwan down. Self-deprecation.
Exactly. It points to him seeming overly impressed by, honestly, really basic things in China.
Like being shocked that airport bathrooms have doors.
Seriously. Apparently so.
Yeah.
Or getting super excited about hotel food delivery robots and asking, wow, does Taiwan even have this?
Which is just baffling. Because, Taiwan does have that stuff.
Yeah.
Delivery robots aren't exactly alien tech there.
Yeah.
So the reaction wasn't just, oh, he's being polite.
No, the commentary framed it as genuine, over-the-top astonishment. And it gets worse. There were mentions of comments where he seemed to suggest Taiwan's environment is degenerate and dangerous.
Yeah, I saw that bit. Something about knife attacks on the subway. Trying to paint Taiwan in a bad light, it seemed, especially right next to all this praise for the mainland.
And that feeds right into this huge contrast everyone noticed, his image back home versus how he came across in China.
Right, in Taiwan. Hard-hitting, direct, speaks his mind.
But in China, during these streams, the descriptions used were things like timid country bumpkin, just bowled over by everyday infrastructure.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
That perceived shift, that inconsistency, that's what really got people talking, huh?
Oh, absolutely. The backlash was immediate and pretty brutal. Across different platforms, X, Weibo, Taiwanese forums, people piled on.
What kind of things were they saying?
Well, lots of mockery. Stuff like, dude's never seen the world, or country bumpkin hits the big city, and lots of people pointing out, yeah, we have those things in Taiwan.
And from the Taiwanese side specifically.
A lot of frustration, it seems. Comments like he totally lost himself for money, or that his behavior was a disgrace to Taiwanese people.
So a key criticism running through it all, especially from Taiwan, was this idea that he's only brave where it's safe.
Exactly. Super outspoken back home, but then appearing kind of subservient or overly amazed and polite once he's on the mainland. That contrast just didn't sit well.
Okay, but were there any other explanations offered? Any defense for his actions?
Yeah, the materials do touch on that, but also kind of poke holes in those defenses.
Like what?
Well, the simple arguments. Maybe he was just being, humble and polite as a guest. Standard travel etiquette for some.
Okay, I can see that angle.
Or maybe he was genuinely seeing those specific delivery robots for the first time, and his surprise wasn't meant to be a big political statement, just honest curiosity.
Possible.
And then there's the idea that his intention was purely about peace. Bridging the gap, given his background, maybe.
But the analysis pushes back.
Hard. It argues that focusing only on his possible intent, whether it's politeness or curiosity or peace, misses the bigger picture. It ignores the context, specifically Beijing's potential goals and how these actions might be used.
Okay. So it's not just about him, but how his actions fit into a larger dynamic.
Precisely. And this is where the analysis pivots, connecting his behavior to ideas like cognitive warfare and propaganda.
Right. Moving beyond just one guy's weird trip to seeing it as potentially part of something bigger, strategically.
The argument laid out is that his trip, or at least how it played out publicly, could be seen as a kind of successful demonstration case for Beijing.
Meaning an example of how to use a known Taiwanese personality to potentially shape views, maybe even without them fully realizing it.
That seems to be the implication. The analysis details how his actions line up with known United Front tactics and propaganda themes.
Okay, United Front. Just quickly, that's Beijing's strategy to influence groups outside the mainland, right? To align them with its goals, often unification.
You got it. And cognitive warfare is about messing with people's heads, basically, influencing thoughts and beliefs through information psychology.
So how did his specific actions fit in? That praise for basic stuff.
Seen as a classic tactic, selective display of positive aspects. Show the shiny, convenient things, make the place seem appealing, not so bad.
While conveniently ignoring other stuff.
Exactly. Ignore the political system, the human rights issues, the lack of freedoms. And his more emotional moments, like crying, talking about compatriots saying, our own people shouldn't fight each other.
Yeah.
That language is highlighted as echoing standard CCP rhetoric. This sounds nice, right? Peace, family. But the analysis argues it serves to downplay the actual military threat and Beijing's stated goal of annexation.
It reframes a power imbalance and threat as just a family spat.
Kind of, yeah. And focusing on the robots and the toilets, that's seen as part of this cultural united front. Connect on simple everyday things, build goodwill, while completely sidestepping the huge political gulf and the authoritarian system.
And there were mentions of reports suggesting this isn't random, that Beijing might be actively trying to cultivate Taiwanese online figures.
Yeah, reference to a report by Ba Jiang suggesting systematic efforts to host and potentially influence these individuals for propaganda wins.
So putting it all together, the analysis suggests that even if he didn't go there intending to be a propaganda tool,
his actions, how they were broadcast and perceived, fit really neatly into established patterns of soft propaganda, the kind designed to sort of chip away at negative views of Beijing, focusing on surface stuff and ignoring the deeper problems.
it becomes less about his personal intent and more about how his behavior functioned within that broader information environment, how it could be useful to certain narratives.
It really shows how even seemingly small things can take on huge significance in that kind of charged political context.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit, because the information you shared also dives into a really fundamental question. Why does China have such a negative image internationally? Is it, like, self-inflicted? Or is it more about external forces, maybe brainwashing by Taiwan's DPP or pressure from the U.S.?
Yeah, this is a core debate, and the analysis here comes down pretty firmly on one side. It concludes that, overwhelmingly, China's own actions are the main reason for its negative image.
Okay, so not primarily blaming outside forces. What's the evidence presented for that?
It points to a whole range of factors. First, the internal situation, the authoritarian governance, the human rights record.
Right, things like the situation in Xinjiang, cracking down on dissent, the Great Firewall censorship, what happened in Hong Kong with the national security law. These are widely documented, right?
Absolutely. They reference findings from groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. These aren't secrets. And then there's the external behavior, military expansionism.
Like all the military drills around Taiwan, we hear about those constantly. The Alice has mentioned Thunder 2025A as an example, and actions in the South China Sea too.
Yep. And it cites reactions like condemnations from the G7, reports from Taiwan's own defense ministry. These actions clearly worry other countries.
Plus the whole wolf warrior diplomacy thing, the super aggressive diplomatic style.
And using economic clout like sanctions or trade pressure to get political results, that definitely hasn't won them many friends.
So the argument is you add up the internal repression, the external assertiveness, the aggressive diplomacy. It's not surprising the global view is often negative.
And there's data cited to back that up. Polls, like from Pew Research, showing high negative views globally, like 67%, and the reasons people give. Human rights, military threats, unfair trade. It lines up directly with China's observed actions.
Okay, so the core argument is the image problem starts at home, with Beijing's policies and behavior.
That's the main thrust. Then the analysis tackles those counterarguments. First, the idea that it's DPP brainwashing, making Taiwanese people hate China.
How does it address that claim?
It acknowledges the DPP emphasizes Taiwan sovereignty and talks about the threat from Beijing, sure, but it argues this is mostly based on, well, facts, like the military drills we just mentioned, and it actually aligns with what most Taiwanese people already think.
You mean like public opinion polls showing low support for unification under Beijing's model?
Exactly. So it's less brainwashing and more reflecting a genuine sentiment based on perceived threats and different values. The analysis suggests calling it brainwashing is often a narrative used to dismiss legitimate concerns about authoritarianism and military pressure, trying to conflate opposing the CCP with hating Chinese people.
And it also notes the DPP's actual ability to shape international opinion is probably pretty limited compared to China's massive state media apparatus.
Right. Then there's the U.S. pressure argument that America is just out to smear China with sanctions, negative press, supporting Taiwan, etc.
What's the take on that?
It concedes that, yes, U.S. actions do contribute to negative perceptions of China, but crucially, it argues these actions are mostly grounded in factual evidence, citing things like UN human rights reports that raise concerns. And the U.S. isn't alone. Many other countries share these concerns and are taking similar actions, like the EU imposing tariffs.
So the U.S. might amplify the message, but it's not inventing the underlying issues.
That's the conclusion presented. The U.S. role is seen as significant, but ultimately secondary to the fundamental problems created by China's own policies and actions. The U.S. is reacting to and highlighting things that many others also see as problematic.
And this brings us back to the founders from the start. Some of his comments during the live stream, like apparently calling Taiwan brainwashed or trying to frame military tensions as just needing peace between our own people.
Yeah, those comments seem to directly echo the narratives that try to deflect blame onto the DPP or the U.S., rather than acknowledging China's own part in its image problem. So the analysis suggests his words potentially reinforce that deflection narrative.
It really highlights how careful you have to be with language in these situations, how even seemingly emotional appeals can plug into existing political arguments.
Definitely.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Micky to Life. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it. Okay, so let's tackle that first big point that seems to come up. This idea that, seeing it for yourself is the best way. That relying on media maybe isn't great because outlets might have a slant.
Yeah, the seeing is believing argument. Like some media in Taiwan, for example, might be seen as having a particular viewpoint.
So the thinking goes, seeing with your own eyes beats hearing about it secondhand. Better than 1,000 words, right?
And look, that firsthand experience is valuable, no doubt.
Yeah.
But the counterpoint that analysts bring up is interesting. It's this idea that what a tourist sees, especially maybe on an organized trip, could be a bit like, stage scenery.
Stage scenery. How so?
Well, think about the examples mentioned, like super impressive city infrastructure, gleaming buildings, maybe even robot servers or really modern public toilets.
Okay, yeah.
These things, especially in major hubs like Shanghai or Shenzhen, they might be highlighted as model projects. They're real, sure, but perhaps specifically showcased, designed to impress.
Okay. So what does that kind of tourism observation potentially miss then, according to these analyses?
It can very easily skim over the deeper systemic stuff, things that aren't immediately visible.
Like what?
Like limits on free speech, maybe the independence of the courts or human rights concerns in certain regions, the stuff international organizations often report on.
Right.
And you even see accounts mentioned like foreign journalists saying they were questioned just trying to film, normal street scenes.
Yeah.
It's about what maybe isn't shown.
That definitely adds a layer. So it makes you, the listener, wonder, right? How do you balance what you might see yourself with that kind of broader systemic picture?
Which leads perfectly into the next layer, really.
Yeah.
Public figures, their trips, and their platforms.
Yeah, this Taiwanese figure's trip, he shared what he saw, praised things like infrastructure, talked a lot about peace, but then got quite a bit of backlash. And his response was basically, hey, I was just documenting my trip, trying to be neutral, seeking peace. He urged people not to misunderstand.
But the criticism, as analyses point out, wasn't necessarily about his intent. It was more about how the trip could be used, intentionally or not.
Used how?
Well, the observation was that he focused a lot on the shiny, visible things, the amenities, while seeming to avoid those tougher systemic questions we talked about.
Okay.
Plus, there was commentary on the language used. Phrases like calling people compatriots or saying, don't fight your own people. Analysts noted this kind of language often fits certain established political narratives.
And that matters because someone with a big public profile, their words carry weight, a lot of weight.
Exactly. Huge influence. And some sources mention that there might be, wider efforts to invite and perhaps influence public figures' online personality.
Really?
Yeah, some reports have even tracked instances where maybe someone's tone on sensitive topics seemed to shift after visiting certain places.
Wow. So it makes you wonder what's actually happening behind the scenes. Was it direct influence? Or maybe just seeing a limited perspective.
Analyses float different possibilities, maybe hopes for business opportunities down the line.
Yeah.
Perhaps feeling the pressure of, the surveillance systems that are widely reported.
Or could it just be not having the full international context, maybe, making it easier to be guided by what you're shown?
All plausible factors to consider. It's complex. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What are the main takeaways from this deep dive into the info you shared?
Well, it seems this figure's visit really exposed some stark contradictions and ignited a huge debate. The analysis suggests his actions, particularly the live-streamed parts, led many to see him as potentially playing a role, intended or not, in promoting narratives favorable to Beijing.
And that this fits into broader patterns potentially related to cognitive warfare or soft propaganda, focusing on the surface, the positive spin, while ignoring the tough realities.
Right. And crucially, when looking at why China faces international criticism, the analysis strongly concludes it stems primarily from its own actions, internal policies, external behavior, rather than just being manufactured by outside forces like Taiwan's DPP or the U.S.
It really drives home the need for critical thinking, doesn't it? Especially with information coming from potentially controlled or influenced environments. The advice seems to be check against independent international reports, look at broader data.
A balanced view, yeah.
It leaves you with a question, though. In this world, just flooded with information, competing stories, how do you, listening right now, handle it all? Especially when maybe someone you thought you understood presents a completely different side.
Yeah, what skills do you find most vital for telling the difference between genuine observation and maybe something else? Messaging that's been shaped or influenced. It's something we all grapple with, definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive on Sip and Talk.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And hey, also check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel. It's really interesting stuff. Definitely worth a look.
Catch you next time.